Welcome back. That is assuming you went anywhere. So last time we talked about why we seem to spend so much time talking about polls that we know can be wrong. This lecture is going to be organized on the history of pre-election polling. How long has pre-election polling been part of the election landscape in the United States? And what can our past experience with the pre-election poll reveal about the nature of polling today? So the elections we're going to talk about today may be ancient history to you, but I think they're interesting for two reasons. First, they show that the reasons for pre-election polling that we talked about last time are not new. The focus, if not obsession, that we have with pre-election polls has been with us for more than 100 years. And second, the major polling fails we're going to discuss will help illuminate what we, as citizens and consumers of pre-election polls, really need to think about when listening to people opine about the importance and meaning of pre-election polls today. So where exactly are we going to go on this journey through poll land? So we're going to take a very brief trip through three presidential elections: 1916, 1936, and 1948. And we're going to use each election to not only describe what happened, but also to illustrate an important concept in pre-election polling. We're going to ask three questions for each presidential election we talk about. First, what happened? Second, why? And third, and perhaps most importantly, what concept does this reveal about polling in general? So the insights from this journey will reveal insights that are still relevant for understanding many of the conversations that we have today about pre-election polling. So while the technology, candidates, and voters may change tremendously over time, the essential questions and issues with pre-election polling never seem to do. To begin, let us step more than 100 years ago to the 1916 presidential election between the Democrat president, Woodrow Wilson from New Jersey, although he was raised in the South and considered himself a Southerner, and the Republican candidate, Charles Hughes from New York. To provide a snippet of context, the 1916 presidential election was being held as the First World War was raging in Europe, the women's suffrage movement was continuing to gain momentum in the United States, and Jim Crow laws were being widely used throughout the South to suppress the vote of black males. Although presidents have tended to be reelected more often than not in recent years, it's important to note that at the time when President Wilson was running for re-election in 1916, the last president to be re-elected was President Andrew Jackson in 1832. Thus, the re-election of President Wilson was far from certain. In fact, given the inability of sitting presidents to win re-election at the time, most thought that Wilson's defeat was the most likely outcome. It is against this backdrop that the weekly magazine published out of New York City called the Literary Digest decided to conduct a straw poll of its readers. As we talked about last, the Literary Digest decided to do a poll to help publicize the magazine and sell more subscriptions, and also to give themselves something to write about. The poll was also thought to be possibly attractive to potential subscribers. After all, not only did subscribers to the Literary Digest get the actual magazine, but they also got the chance to participate in the magazine's pre-election polling to let people know what they thought about the issues of the day. So here's the actual front page from the November 4th, 1916 edition of the Literary Digest. As you can see, just like today, the poll is the lead story. Digging deeper, the lead story describes and motivates how they did the poll of 30,000 readers in 5 big doubtful states that the Literary Digest surveyed for the 1916 presidential election. The way the poll worked is that every subscriber to the Literary Digest living in New York, New Jersey, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, the 5 states that were thought to be critical at the time, was mailed a postcard by the Literary Digest. The postcard that they were sent looked like the image displayed on the front page. Respondents were asked to give what their state was and then post an X mark next to the candidate they supported in 1916 and what they did in 1912. All told, nearly 50,000 postcards were sent out by Literary Digest, one to each mail subscriber because they're the only ones who could vote, and 30,000 of those postcards were returned to Literary Digest. 30,000 postcards returned in 5 states, all of which Literary Digest predicted for Republican Hughes. How would they do? Well, we can look at the election outcome to figure out how well the 1916 Literary Digest poll did at predicting the actual election outcome and to see whether or not President Wilson was reelected or not. So how well did the Literary Digest poll of 1916 do? Well, it turns out that the poll correctly predicted 4 out of the 5 states, missing only in Ohio. So despite correctly predicting 4 out of 5 states, however, President Wilson was reelected in a squeaker. So the poll got it right, but also got it wrong in terms of who actually won. In fact, the final outcome was not known until 2 days after Election Day, when the results of California and Ohio finally came in. Now, although the Electoral College map looks like a blowout, which is an important point to note for today, geographic maps are always politically misleading whenever the political power of a state is different from its geographic area. Wilson won the presidency by winning California by a mere 3,773 male voters. Now, of course, every state is critical in this kind of level, but because of how close California was, we typically say that California was the reason that Wilson won in 1960. So as an interesting side note, President Wilson was the last sitting president to be reelected until 1936, meaning that between 1832 and 1932, the only sitting U.S. president to be reelected to office was President Woodrow Wilson. And speaking of 1936, so the 1936 election took place during the Great Depression, and unemployment levels continued to be extremely high even after 4 years of FDR's presidency, typically a really bad sign for incumbents. And remember that this was a time when presidents, except for Woodrow Wilson, were unable to win re-election. So into the fray entered the sitting incumbent President Democrat Franklin Delano Roosevelt from New York and the Republican Alf Landon from Kansas. The Literary Digest again entered the fray with a pre-election poll. In fact, since 1916, when they correctly predicted 4 out of the 5 states, but not the overall presidency, the Literary Digest had correctly predicted every single presidential election. As a result, its polling release was one of the most famous and widely anticipated events of the election. In 1936, the Literary Digest took their polling to new heights, and they went all out in terms of the size and expense of their poll. Here's the cover for the issue announcing the final returns on October 31st, 1936, immediately before Election Day. As you can see, and as was the case in 1916 and still today, the results of pre-election polling took center stage. As an aside, if you think that watching election night coverage is a contemporary thing, here's an advertisement for Goodyear tires. This so-called Polometer sheet is a tally sheet that people could use to record the Literary Digest results from each week of results, starting with September 2nd. Moreover, if you look carefully, you'll note that there were 3 radio broadcasts every week devoted to the latest poll results. Our obsession with pre-election polls is not a new thing. The results of the poll were widely reported, not only by the Literary Digest, but by other organizations as well, because of how accurate the Literary Digest poll had been and how famous it was as a result. Here's an excerpt of the final polling results as it was reported on the front page of one local newspaper. This crazy table shows the breakdown not only by state, but also by who the voter reported supporting in 1932. There is an amazing amount of data here, and think about how many stories could be written to interpret what this means for the final outcome. In terms of that final outcome, check out the numbers on the last row reporting the total vote. Landon, 1,293,669. Roosevelt, 972,897. So how did the Literary Digest get all these responses? By 1936, the methodology of the Literary Digest had changed only slightly. Whereas in 1916, the Literary Digest sought the opinions of their subscribers alone, by 1936 they had grown their operation, and they now used every telephone directory, magazine subscription list, and roster of clubs and associations that they could obtain. So they mailed the postcard to every single individual listed in a directory in the United States. So here's an example of a poll they did around Prohibition. Every person with a known address was mailed a secret ballot postcard that they were then asked to return. The image on the left is the envelope they were sent, and the image on the right is the postcard they were asked to file and fill out and return. To predict the outcome, in this case the amount of support for Prohibition, the Literary Digest would then simply add up the responses and announce the results. To predict the 1936 presidential election, this is the postcard that Literary Digest used. Individuals were asked which candidate they preferred in 1936, who they supported in 1932, if they voted, and where they lived. For the 1936 election, the Literary Digest asked 10 million people and received 2.4 million postcards back. Think about that number for a second. The 1936 Literary Digest poll had 2.4 million responses. Because total turnout in 1936 was 43 million, this meant that nearly 5.5% of the electorate responded. This is still the largest single pre-election poll that's ever been done. By way of comparison, recall from last time that in the last 2 weeks of 2016, nearly 230,000 people were interviewed in state-level polls. In other words, the 1936 Literary Digest poll had nearly 10 times as many respondents as the last batch of pre-election polls in 2016. And in 2016, we have something called the internet that lets us contact lots of people very quickly. In their October 31st issue, the Literary Digest reported the final tally. In describing what they did, they noted in the second paragraph that, quote, "These figures are exactly as received from more than 1 in every 5 voters polled in our country, and they are neither weighted, adjusted, nor interpreted." As to the accuracy of the poll and the reason as to why they should be trusted, the Literary Digest was both cautious but also somewhat cocky. As they write, quote, "So far, we have been right in every poll. Will we be right in the current poll? That, as Mrs. Roosevelt said concerning the president's re-election, is in the lap of the gods. We never make any claims before the election, but we respectfully refer you to the opinion of one of the most quoted citizens today, the Honorable James A. Farley, chairman of the Democratic National Committee. This is what Mr. Farley said October 14th, 1932. Quote, "Any sane person cannot escape the implication of such a gigantic sampling of popular opinion as is embraced in the Literary Digest straw poll. The Literary Digest is an achievement of no little magnitude. It is a poll fairly and correctly conducted." Unquote. So how did they do? Well, with 2.4 million responses and a 20-year history of successfully predicting presidential elections, they obviously nailed it. President Landon was easily elected in 1936, exactly as predicted. Or not. So despite winning the Literary Digest poll in a landslide, 57% to 43%, in the poll that actually counted on Election Day, Republican Alf Landon was crushed, 62% to 38%, and FDR was reelected. The Literary Digest was literally devastated. It was called before Congress to testify, and it was out of business by 1938, in part because of the polling disaster of 1936. So despite being the largest pre-election poll in history, and even to this day, the Literary Digest got it wrong. And not a little bit wrong, a lot bit wrong. Wrong winner, Wrong margin. Instead of Landon winning by 14 as predicted, FDR won by 24, a whopping 38-point difference in the predicted outcome. 2.4 million respondents, 5.5% of the electorate, and a 38-point polling error. Absolutely amazing. The error made by Literary Digest poll is that who is asked by a poll is far more important than how many. Big data is not going to give you the right answer if the data doesn't reflect the situation that you're trying to measure. This is a lesson that's still true today. So think again about how the Literary Digest tried to determine who was going to win in 1936. They relied on lists of magazine subscribers, telephone directories, and the rosters of clubs and associations. In 1936, in the middle of the Great Depression. Now ask yourself, who is likely to have a magazine subscription or a telephone at that time? Who can afford to belong to a club or association during the Great Depression? These individuals are all likely to be wealthier and therefore more Republican voters. So while the Literary Digest certainly talked to a lot of people, the people they were talking to did not likely reflect the actual electorate. Instead, the people were less likely to be affected by the Great Depression, and as a result, be more likely to support Republican Alf Landon. When the people polled differ from the population we care about in consequential ways, we call this sampling bias. And the 1936 Literary Digest poll is a perfect example of how badly we can be, even when we have lots and lots of data. So clearly, we've learned from this, right? I mean, we don't have issues with sampling bias in 2020, or do we? So here's an example of a poll with sampling bias taken from President Trump's Twitter feed. The results from a survey hosted on Breitbart.com that anyone visiting the site could take around the time of his impeachment. It shows an amazing amount of opposition to the impeachment proceedings. Fully 97.83% indicate that they are opposed and that they stand with President Trump. But who visits Breitbart.com and who is likely to take the survey? Obviously Republicans. So while it's impossible to know how many people took the poll, given that the poll is only asking visitors to Breitbart.com, it would be silly to rely on the poll results to make inferences about public opinion overall. Even if millions of Breitbart readers decide to take the poll, it's not talking to people who don't visit Breitbart.com. And the poll would be a perfectly good poll of Breitbart.com readers think about in the impeachment. But the issue is it doesn't necessarily reflect what people who don't visit Breitbart.com think. And that's typically what we want to do when we do public opinion poll. We don't just want to capture the views of a small set of people, but we want to be able to generalize to talk about what the electorate overall thinks about what's going on in the politics today. Here's another example, this time from 2012. These are the results of the Marist poll from Florida. Recall that Marist poll has an A+ rating from 538.com. So overall, Democrat Barack Obama was predicted to defeat Republican Mitt Romney in Florida 48% to 44%. That's the number on the top row. But among registered voters reached by landlines, the Republican Mitt Romney was predicted to win Florida by 3%. 48% to 45%. But when registered voters were contacted via cell phone, the results flip entirely. Now Barack Obama is predicted to win the voters by a whopping 23 percentage points, 57% to 34%. Much like the Literary Digest poll, if only landlines were used, or even if we only use cell phones, the outcome would be very different from what actually happened, because registered voters with landlines are very different from registered voters with cell phones. So if we don't use both, we're going to get very misleading answers. So the problem is not in terms of how many voters are being talked to. Instead, the problem is whether the voters you are talking to reflect the overall electorate. This is the problem of sampling bias. And for pollsters, it means that how you contact voters can really affect who you're able to reach, and therefore how generalizable the results that you find are actually going to be. Although the Literary Digest did not realize that they had a problem in what they were doing, a market researcher named George Gallup did. He thought that the Literary Digest was likely to make a mistake in predicting the 1936 election because of who they were interviewing. He thought they were likely to overestimate Republican support in the middle of the Great Depression, which they did. To prove his point, and to also try to position the market research company he had just started for future business, he conducted a much smaller survey of only 50,000 people to predict the 1936 election. Of course, size is relative. The size of his survey was still larger than any single poll being done in the last 2 weeks prior to the 2016 presidential election. To make his point, Gallup tried to predict not only the outcome on election day, but also what the final prediction of the Literary Digest poll would be. Gallup was interested in predicting not only the actual election outcome, but also whether he could correctly predict just how wrong the Literary Digest poll would be. As you can see from the first row of this table, FDR got 62% of the votes on election day. As the last row reports, Gallup predicted FDR would get 56%. So not only did Gallup correctly predict the winner, but he was also much closer to the actual outcome than the Literary Digest, who predicted that FDR would only get 43% of the vote. But perhaps more impressive is the fact that Gallup also correctly predicted just how wrong the Literary Digest poll would be. He predicted that the Literary Digest poll would predict that FDR would only receive 44% of the support in their poll. As I just noted, this was off by a single point. The Literary Digest poll predicted that FDR would only get 43%. Not only did Gallup correctly predict the election outcome in 1936, but he was also able to predict the mistakes being made by his competitor. So what was the secret sauce? What did Gallup do differently from the Literary Digest? The answer is that Gallup tried to predict the electorate electorate first, then interview enough people who look like that prediction to predict what would happen. Rather than just rely on the number of respondents, Gallup relied on some art to first predict what he thought the electorate would look like demographically. An example helps illustrate. An interviewer for Gallup assigned to St. Louis was told to interview 13 people, but not just any people. Instead, they were told to interview specifically 6 people from the suburbs and 7 from the central city. In addition, 7 had to be men and 6 women. Among the men, 3 had to be under 40, 4 above 40, and so on. The basic idea, known as quota sampling, was to define a quota that each interview had to satisfy so that when the results were added up, the total would reflect the views in proportion to the devised quota. Gallup was confident that Literary Digest would be wrong, because where he was confident that the people without telephones and magazine subscriptions would vote, and he knew that these people were not being interviewed by Literary Digest, he could devise a way to talk to them. In short, he could ensure that he talked to people with and without telephones, and people who did not subscribe to Literary Digest. Instead, Literary Digest was relying on only those people that they could contact. Of course, if the pollster gets the quota wrong, they're likely to get the results wrong. But Gallup did a good job with quotas, started in 1936. In fact, because of his accuracy, he was put on the cover of Time magazine just prior to the 1948 presidential election. The cover of Time magazine, 1948, right before the presidential election. Surely no good deed goes unpunished. The 1948 presidential election was a matchup between Democrat Harry Truman, who had been president since the 1945 death of FDR, and Republican Thomas Dewey. For added interest, the pro-segregationalist Dixiecrat Strom Thurmond was also running to protest the civil rights plank adopted in the Democratic Convention. Although World War II had ended a few years prior, severe international and domestic challenges created severe headwinds for the Truman's candidacy, especially given how long the Democrats had held the presidency at this point. Although the Literary Digest had been vanquished and out of print for 10 years, in 1948 there were now polls being done by the Cross-Hurston newspapers, by Roper for Fortune magazine, and by George Gallup for nearly 100 independent newspapers. This again highlights the symbiotic relationship between pre-election polls and the media, a relationship that has been present since the inception of pre-election polling. Although the sample size had fallen considerably since 1936, Gallup was only interviewing 50,000 and Roper only 15,000. These sample sizes are still far larger than most contemporary pre-election polls. And 2 weeks out from Election Day, all the polls showed Dewey with more than a 5-point lead. At the time, political campaigns were largely centered around political conventions. Candidates did not bother traveling around the country campaigning, and the conventional wisdom was that most voters decided who to support during the conventions, because that was the only time when campaigns really took place. In fact, the conventional wisdom was known as Farley's Law, after the DNC chair James Farley, the same individual that the Literary Digest quoted in support of their 1936 poll. So with a 5-point lead in all 3 polls 2 weeks out from Election Day, the media decided the race was essentially over. Further polling was not needed. Now, it was true that President Truman had decided to travel around the country making additional appeals, but these efforts were widely dismissed. After all, the media knew what was going to happen based on the polls that they had been doing. A political cartoon dated October 19, 1948 aptly summarizes this conventional wisdom. Truman was clearly done for, and the Republican Thomas Dewey would surely be elected according to the experts. Or not. Although Dewey was indeed leading in the polls, digging deeper revealed that many voters were uncertain as to who they were going to vote for. Careful analysis after the fact reveals that nearly 15% of the voters were undecided and that they would decide only in the last 2 weeks, and after pollsters had stopped polling. So a somewhat obvious problem for polling is that if voters have not yet made up their mind, it's going to be very hard to predict who they're going to support. Or if they change their minds after they stop polling, you're guaranteed to miss them. One lesson pollsters took from 1948 was the necessity of polling right up to Election Day to help capture late deciding voters. However, even polling up to Election Day cannot avoid the possibility of error if voters only decide on Election Day, something we'll see when we dive in to see what happened in 2016. Our journey through historical pre-election polling has revealed 2 problems. Sampling bias, that was the example in 1936, where when they only talked to people who subscribed to magazines, Literary Digest missed those who didn't. And the second one we just talked about is if pollsters don't poll, they're not going to be able to capture late shifts. So to these 2, we're going to add a third, another example of what happened in the 1948 presidential election. So in every case we've considered thus far, 1916, 1936, and now 1948, the polls have all overpredicted Republican support. But the reason why the Literary Digest was off in 1916, and also 1936, is hopefully clear by now. They were only interviewing voters who could afford magazines and telephones, and these voters are likely to overpredict Republicans. However, even the quota sampling being done by George Gallup at these times was also overpredicting Republican support. In fact, in every presidential election year, the Gallup poll overpredicted Republican support by 5 points in 1936, by 3 points in 1940, by 2 points in 1944, and by 5 points in 1948. What's going on here? Now recall that Gallup was using a quota So one possibility is that he was defining the quota of people to be interviewed in ways that produce a true Republican sample, but it seems like another possibility is out there, and that there's a non-response bias in who is willing to talk to interviewers. If Republicans were more likely to talk to interviewers than Democrats, or if interviewers were more likely to interview Republicans and Democrats, then even if geography, age, and gender quotas are exactly right, the results will still be wrong. Well, it seems hard to imagine today that Republicans would be more willing to talk to pollsters than Democrats. The 1940s were a different time period, and it's not difficult to imagine that interviewers would be more likely to approach some individuals in some neighborhoods than others, and that these decisions could be based on class and wealth considerations that would result in a pro-Republican bias in who is being talked to by the pollsters as they try to fill their quota. So the third issue that we worry about that illustrated in 1948 was the issue of non-response. That is, even if I exactly know what the electorate's going to look at, who I talk to can really influence the results. So I might be talking to the right number of men and women, and my age and regional distribution may be exactly spot on, but if the people who are willing to talk to me in those regions or among those men and women are different from who the actual electorate is, then I've got a real problem. So non-response results in the error that not everyone I want to talk to as a pollster may be willing to talk to me, and the result of that could produce errors. The problem of non-response is a problem we still see today in polling. So here are some results of some analysis I've been working on that looks at non-response in exit polls. So these are the polls that we do on election day to try to figure out what voters think when they're coming out of the polling booth. So each dot here is on the graph is a precinct in the 2018 midterm election. So this one, for example, is one precinct. This is a different precinct. Here's yet a different precinct. So each one of the column here represents a different place where voters cast their vote. So what we're looking at here is the X's tell us how many votes were actually cast for the Democrat in each precinct. So here's a precinct that's extremely Republican. Less than 3% of the voters there voted for the Democrats. Whereas over these precincts over here, these are precincts where nearly 90% of the voters voting at that place voted for the Democratic candidate. And so what we want to know to assess non-response is to see, well, how do the people who take the exit poll compare to the people who are casting votes in that particular polling place? And so the truth are these X's. That's how many people voted in a precinct and what the vote was in terms of the 2018 midterm election. Now these diamonds, that tells you what the exit poll results said in that precinct. So put differently, here's what the actual precinct voted. These are the results of what the people from that precinct who decided to take the exit poll revealed about their voting behavior. And so if you look at this, you can see a couple patterns. So first of all, you can see that there's a lot more diamonds above this line than below. So what does that mean? Well, because our y-axis is the percentage of people who say they support the Democratic candidate in the midterm election, the fact that the exit polls results are higher than the actual votes themselves means that the people who took the exit polls were more likely to report voting for Democrats than cast votes for the Democratic candidate in the actual election day voting. So whether this means that people were lying, or whether only some people, and in particular Democrats, were more likely to talk to the pollsters in the exit polls is a little bit unclear. But there are instances, for example, where the exit polls dramatically understate Democrats. But by and large, we can see that the exit polls tend to contain people who are more Democratic-leaning than Republican-leaning. Now that said, a couple caveats. One is that these are all unweighted results, and so we'll talk about what that exactly means later, but this is just the raw people, right? We're not trying to take any account of what their demographics are and whether those demographics can be adjusted statistically to try to make the results better. And the second important point to note that even though these numbers look very different, which is that the diamonds aren't exactly on the X's, and some of these errors are really, really large, right? So here's a case where the people who answered the exit poll, more than 85% said they would support the Democratic candidate, whereas they were in a precinct where around 30% of the voters actually voted for the Democratic candidate. The second one is that because there's such small samples for most of these cases, that if we look at how much uncertainty there is in here, again, a technical term that we can cover later, that 77% of the exit polls that are being done, even when unweighted, contain the true value. That is, if we account for the fact that this may only reflect 10 people, and how the average of 10 people is pretty imprecisely estimated, that once we account for that the difference between these diamonds and these X's is smaller than what it appears to be. But even so, it kind of shows systematically that if we look at today, it seems to be the case that people willing to take exit polls are more likely voting for Democrats than people voting their ballots in those very same precincts, which is kind of an interesting dichotomy. Earlier in the 1940s, we were worried about polling being too Republican. Now, it seems like polls are a little bit too Democrat. Before we go much further, I think it's really important to be clear on a couple things. So first of all, the fact that we know that non-response bias exists means that as pollsters, we can do something to adjust that, right? So the world is not as dire as it may look. So you can't just look at that graph and say, my goodness, all polling is bad. We can see quite clearly there's huge errors. Pollsters, by and large, know that. And so then the question is, can we fix that using adjustments? And we'll talk about that later. The second thing is that I was talking about exit polls. And so just so you're clear, When we call elections on election night, we don't use exit polls. The only thing we use exit polls for is to help understand what voters are thinking when they're casting their ballot. We never actually use that to make a projection as to which candidate does or does not win a particular state. So if you're worried that the error that we just saw could affect how well networks are able to call the election on election night, don't be, because we use better data. The issue of non-responses, that's something that every pollster must worry about today. So here are the results of a recent Vanderbilt poll that Dean Gear and I conducted to gauge public opinion among registered voters in Tennessee. So what's interesting is to compare how the unweighted column compares to the parameter column. The parameter column is a percentage of registered voters in Tennessee that share that demographic feature. Thus, 46.4% of registered voters in Tennessee are male, 53.6% are female, 16.5% are between the ages of 18 and 29, and so forth. These values are all provided by either voter registration data or census data. The unweighted column describes who chooses to respond to our Vanderbilt polls. Following best practices in the industry, we call every landline and cell phone up to 5 times. So if you compare the percentage in the parameter column to the unweighted column, you can see that how the people are willing to take a poll from Vanderbilt University over a landline or cell phone compare to the overall population of registered voters in Tennessee. You can see some striking things. First, poll responses are clearly more likely to be older. 16.5% of registered voters in Tennessee are between the ages of 18 and 29, but only 7.4% of our respondents are in the same age range. In contrast, 18.2% of registered voters are between the ages of 55 and 64, only 29.4% of our respondents lie between those ages. There are also pretty serious issues with education. 40.3% of registered voters are a high school graduate or less, but only 25.1% of our respondents fall into this education category. Although only 34.4% of registered voters in Tennessee are college graduates, nearly 47% of our respondents indicate they graduate from college. So poll respondents are far more educated on average than the average voter. Even though we are randomly calling numbers from a list of registered voters in Tennessee, the people who choose to respond to our poll differ from those who do not. This is the essential problem of non-response. Our respondents, like most poll respondents, are too female, too old, too non-Hispanic white, and too educated compared to the actual electorate. So what are we supposed to do? So remember how I said that polling is both an art and also a science? Well, at this point, to try to adjust these differences is where the science and a little bit of algebra come into play. So the basic idea is pretty general. If we have too many of one type of voter in our sample, we need to downweight their opinions. And if we have too few of another type of voters, we need to upweight their opinions. So in our Vanderbilt poll, we have way too many educated people. So instead, if we upweight the views of those who are less than college education and downweight those who are college educated, then we can hope that our results better match what the electorate looks like. That is, because we exactly know what the composition of voters in the state of Tennessee look like, we can make sure to adjust our sample statistically so that when we weight the respondents, the weighted response look exactly what the state looks like demographically. But the basic idea I think is pretty important to understand, and also hopefully rather straightforward. So look at what we have going on among voters between ages of 18 and 29 in our survey. So when we talk to them, we only get 7.4% of the people, which means that if we look at all the people we talk to in our survey, only 7.4% are between the ages of 18 and 29. But we know, using the voter sample of Tennessee, that 16.5% of voters in the state of Tennessee are between the ages of 18 and 29. Thus, the percentage of people that we're talking to in that age group is much less than what we actually ought to be. But also the solution presents itself. So if we double how much each of those voters counts, which is instead of having only them count for one response, we basically double the responses, and so they give 2 responses, then that will basically get us very, very close. And in fact, after weighting, the percentage of people who are in the age of 18 to 29 range is increased to 15.3%, closer to the truth. And conversely, people who we have too many of in our sample, so here we have 29.4% among the ages of 55 to 64, we need to downweight them. So instead of fully counting the responses, we'll give them a much lower weight, so they count for less than one full person. And so after weighting, their percentage in our sample is going to fall from nearly 30% to only 18.5%. So again, the general idea is that if we know what the population looks like, and here we do because of the census and the voter rolls, we can therefore adjust the sample who decides to take our poll to better reflect that. And that's the process of weighting. Now, of course, this is going to be very difficult for pre-election poll because one of the things we need to estimate for a pre-election poll is what the electorate's going to look like. And so if I don't know who's going to turn out to vote, that's going to be a problem. Because if I guess the electorate wrong and I make weights based on those wrong guesses, my survey results could be very, very wrong. So we'll talk about that next time, but in theory, if we know what the population is supposed to look like, and we know how our sample differs from that population, then we can use statistics and some basic math to do some adjustments that by and large will make our results much more accurate than if we relied on the unweighted data. And that's kind of what modern polling is doing. It's all about figuring out what the adjustments are and how do we make them so that the respondents who we're talking to better reflects the actual population. So there's a science part, but there's also pretty clearly an art part. And you need to understand both if you really want to assess how much you should trust the poll numbers that you're being told about. So let's bring this puppy home. The last two lectures have tried to give you a very broad introduction into why we see so much pre-election polling, and also what's been learned from the pre-election polling mistakes over time. I hope that our journey through Polland together has empowered you to be able to answer the following questions. These answers are still important for understanding and assessing the polls that we read about today. So we have talked about several types of mistakes that pre-election polls can make, but you need to understand why. It's not enough to simply scream, fake polls. We live in a data-rich world, and given how many decisions are being made on the basis of data, it's absolutely essential that you be able to assess those database claims. The concepts of sampling bias and non-response bias, for example, are important not only for polling, but also for many database claims. So, where to next? Well, having given you a brief overview of some historic polling fails, next time we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the methodology of polling to help better equip you in the essential task of evaluating polling-based claims. I strongly believe that the insights we cover are relevant not only for understanding politics and political coverage, but also more generally for critically assessing all of the many polling-based claims that we regularly encounter in our day-to-day lives. Stay safe, stay sane, and stay healthy. And I'm always available online. So if you have a question, you want to chat, send me an email, and maybe I'll see you online in Zoom. All right, take care all.